I am a 24-year-old Gen Z. I overthink all the time and I have high anxiety essentially throughout the day. How do I get out of my own head?
Well, it's a good question, and it's actually mostly like a starting point, right? It's sort of somebody shows up, and I'm not trying to say that I'm a doctor. I am not. I want people to know that. But somebody shows up to the doctor's office and says, I have XYZ condition, or I'm experiencing this symptom, or whatever, right? That's the starting point for somebody to probe further and say, we need to figure out what exactly is going on here. So I look at that question and I think to myself, the first thing that we need to do is we need to figure out what is your lifestyle like? How much stress are you putting upon yourself? How much stress is the world putting upon you? What are the different routines and activities that you get into on a regular basis, and how do those contribute to your mental state, your stress levels, and your well being? And then also, what's going on inside? How do you talk to yourself? What are you asking yourself? What beliefs do you have? So again, it's a starting point, and there's a lot of different pathways that we can and should walk down once we think about that question. But that's how I would initially react to that.
That's perfect. Would it be cool if we create a caricature and then you can probably diagnose it and see where we go from there?
That would be great. I will just say I'm legally not qualified to diagnose, but I am happy to give my own take.
We can call it a quasi-diagnosis if people are going to take it the
Cool.
wrong way, because I know my generation likes to do that anyway. Okay, so I said I'm a 24-year-old Gen Z. That's all true. I don't really have high anxiety throughout the day, but that's because I do a lot of meditation and a lot of emotional work anyway. But let's broaden it out to my entire generation because they do have a lot of anxiety socially, romantically, physically, mentally, even presciently. They have future anxiety. They have anxiety about the climate. And so when you were talking about getting out of one's head, is there a starting point in terms of the layer? Do you have to start in the emotional, the mental, the physical?
I really don't think it matters. I think it's a case by case basis. So, what does the person that we're talking to, what's most impactful for them? And that's, how we start that investigation is by saying, like, hey, what's going on? How you feeling? What are you thinking about? Why do you feel anxious right now? Right. And the response to that question will tell me what threads are we pulling on next. And it's a bit of an onion, right? In the sense that we are eventually going to go layer by layer and go deeper and figure out, like, okay, at some point, maybe we can't do this in an hour. Most therapists would say this takes a long, long time, but eventually we peel back those layers of the onion. We get to some root causes or some root sources, and we try to alleviate or heal those, if you will.
One of the problems I see my generation facing is that they have high anxiety on things that they just fundamentally cannot control. I think that those are inextricably linked in some way. And so, not to make it political, but there's a lot of political anxiety. So when we're talking about either the climate or my generation hates Trump, stuff like that, things that they fundamentally cannot do anything about, and I'll asterisk that just to come back to it later. They have so much anxiety about this, and you see that through all their conversations in terms of their inability to do basic humanistic things like make eye contact, like, engage in modern social interaction, to not engage with their smartphones and mobile devices, etc. How would you start the conversation with a Gen Z or a Gen Alpha who is dealing with this inability to let go, and as a result getting this high anxiety and not being able to get out of their own head?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that run through my mind at the moment. And again, it is a little bit of a case by case basis thing. But so we'll go back to the idea of talking to that person, figuring out what they are dealing with or struggling with, and just asking them basic questions around what is this topic? How does it make you feel? How do you think about it? Okay, when you respond in a certain fashion and you say, I think about the political climate and I get so angry because things aren't going the way that I want them to, and I can't do anything about it. And it's just so not right to see all these different things happening, right? We want to pull on each of those threads and say, okay, you had mentioned, right? Again, this is all kind of hypothetical, but you had mentioned that all these things are happening that you feel as though you have no control over and they are not right, right? So let's be as specific as we can. Have that person name one, two, or three multiple of these things that are happening that are not right, that they have no control over, or maybe they do, right? What we're trying to do is be as specific as possible. So that way we go further and further down, and eventually we get to the point of saying, it's a little cheesy, but it's like going into the stoicism route and saying, this old, kind of old way of thinking, this old philosophy, and basically saying, focus on what you can control and let go of all the rest. It it's obviously simplistic and it's not always that easy to just be like, I can't control this thing, so I'm going to let it go. But, the real I'd say the nuance with an approach like that is to ask those layering questions and eventually get to the point of saying there is actually something about this situation that you can control, but you have to figure out what that is. And then you also have to figure out at what level am I okay with putting in some level of effort and saying that I am controlling that one aspect of this thing, and then I am gonna kind of walk away at that point or be content with my effort, right? So, an example that I will give, I think it's probably relevant, is when I was 28, I went through this horrible depressive episode, mostly around the climate, but also life and death. And it was spurred by, I learned all this stuff about global warming and the way that we're harming the planet and the fact that we might extinguish mankind and whatnot. And when you start to unpack that, you're like, that is so heavy and that is so emotional and so deep. And I had no idea how to process it. And I was just beside myself. And then, from that sort of seed of thinking, okay, here's this horrible, scary topic, I went off into all sorts of different rabbit holes. What helped me eventually was to say, look, something like global warming, right? Going through this exercise and saying, what is it about it that scares me the most? What is it that I could do that would help me feel a little bit better about this issue? And then at what point do I put in enough effort to say, I've done what I can, and now I need to drop this thing, if that makes sense. So for me, right, it was getting to the point, and I think this will be helpful for listeners, is saying, like, you do have to get to the point of understanding that a big topic, right, whether it's politics, whether it's climate change, whether it's the rights of certain people, right, one person, 99.999% of the time, one person does not ultimately change or fix that issue, right? It's a large issue that gets fixed over the course of lots of time by individual people contributing their efforts and caring about that thing, right? So seeing it from that vantage point, you almost have to get to the point of saying, okay, how do I fit into that puzzle? And what level of effort can I give such that me being that piece in that larger puzzle is something that I am okay with? And for me, the climate change piece was understanding that, look, India, China, different countries don't have the same sorts of regulatory policies around, emissions and all that stuff. And I am not going to change that, right? Now you have the Greta Thunbergs of the world who I give her a lot of credit. She has been out there, doing her activism and all that. We all have to decide where we're going to fit on that ladder, right? In terms of, do we dedicate our entire lives to something like climate change or a subject that we really care about, or do we invest 3 hours a week, 10 hours a week, whatever? So for me, I really did as much research as I could do, and I said, look, like, I'm not getting into geopolitics, I'm not getting into public policy. It's just not something that I'm passionate about. But I am passionate about, like, making an impact in my own life, and so I drew the distinction to say, where I feel as though I can exert some effort and have a very, very, very small amount of control over this issue is in how I show up every day. And so I said to myself, look, I'm going to start making different decisions, and I'm going to start reducing my own carbon footprint. So that means I'm going to fly less. I am not saying that people need to do this, but the I guess if you really look into the sources of fuel and all that, like, it might not even matter. I don't know, but I went out and I traded in my car and I bought an electric vehicle. I compost all of my food scraps. I recycle as often as I can. And again, it's like going through every layer of it and saying, like, even though all, like, there are arguments to be made against some of those activities. I or you or somebody who's listening still has to look at those things and say, I'm okay with that. I'm doing the best that I can. I am going to stop punishing myself for this issue that I'm making an impact on, and yet I don't have full control over. So there's one thing that I want to end with here, which is basically, and just, on this subject, right, is there's a book called The Road Less Traveled. I believe the author is M. Scott Peck. And he says that, I'm going to use the wrong terms because it's been a while since I read it, but he said that psychosis or, you know, different issues that arise in the mind. We'll say psychosis for now. That's probably not the right term, but psychosis arises when we take too much responsibility for something that we don't actually have full responsibility over. And that really hit me. It was like I'm putting the weight of the world in terms of climate change on my shoulders, and I'm just one person out of 8 billion across the planet. Now, you can look at that and you can say, I'm one out of 8 billion. Why even try? Why do anything? At the same time, right, I think the more healthy nuance is to land somewhere in the middle and to say, sure, I'm one of 8 billion, but at the same time, my voice matters, my actions matter. I'm going to put in the level of effort that I think can actually make some kind of impact and inspire others to do the same. And I'm going to be okay with that. And I'm going to live with it and I'm going to move on. The last example that I want to give here is, you look at, we're in the US and you look at politics and voting and all that. And a lot of people will say, like, so to someone who says, why compost, why buy an EV, the planet's doomed anyway, one person is not going to change anything. The same argument is made to us in the opposite fashion of, when we say, I'm not going to vote because it's not going to have an impact, people get really upset about that, right? And they say, no, you need to vote, get out and vote, right? And so my argument is just that it's the same thing yet flipped, right? You do have some sort of impact over all of these things through your actions. You just have to find what that impact is, figure out what you have control over, what you don't have control over, and then eventually get to the point of saying, I'm okay with how this calculus totally works out.
Wow. That feels incredibly noble, and that feels good to hear that somebody's on that path. But I do have to ask the difficult question of, is this something that can be abstracted and applied to everybody? Or is this also a case by case basis on how far people can take this and how much they can do? Because Brian, in the United States can do far more than, you know, somebody in Nigeria or somebody in India, right? And also, Brian, and this is maybe a different question, but what Brian does in the United States might be also against what somebody in India or Nigeria wants him to do in terms of solving this. Like the solutions are different. And so I guess, how do we deal with the fact that we're offering solutions to deal with anxiety that might not be able to be initiated to the fullest extent that we're trying to apply them? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely does. I would say in general, right? This is sort of a philosophical lens kind of thing, but like in general, we don't really want to think in terms of absolutes, right? To say this works for everyone, that works for everyone. It kind of doesn't go like that, right? And one of the funny things, I was having a conversation with somebody, with a friend recently, and we're talking about, the book industry or the self-help industry and creating content and all that. And I said, one of the issues with self-help or books in general is somebody finds a solution and their marketing team comes up with this clever concept to say, this is the solution, right? They put it on the market. Maybe it works for 65% of people. But if you look at all those popular books, there's still 2, 5, 8% of people who give it a 1-star or a 2-star review, right? And so what that says to me is, again, there are solutions. There are even some solutions that appeal to a broad audience, but there is never going to be a solution that works for everyone, right? Or at the very least, we can look at this in terms of like a standard distribution curve, and we can say the odds that any one solution works for everyone is like, 0.00001, right? Looking at a bell curve, if you will. in the same sense that water is a good thing for pretty much everybody. I would assume, like there may be some conditions where it's like somebody out there can't drink water, but that is one that is fairly universal. So I look at all of this and I say, when it comes to anxiety, when it comes to mental health, we can't be thinking in absolutes. We have to essentially work through different ideas. And I would even say, too, right, that so if you look at my first book, which is called Get Out of Your Head, A Toolkit for Living with and Overcoming Anxiety, one of the challenges I had in writing it was knowing the fact that not everything works for everybody, right? And so the best solution that I could come up with was to say, I'm going to vet a bunch of different tactics that I've learned on the mental health front over the years, over the course of a decade. And I'm going to curate them and say, look, these ones generally don't work for a lot of people. I'm going to leave those ones out. But these ones that tend to work for a good amount of people, those are going to go into the book and I'm going to share those with people. And then going back to the subtitle of the book and saying a toolkit, right? In the book, I say to readers, look, not everything works for every single person. The same goes for me and you and everybody else that has read this book. At the same time, what we have to do is we have to go through these different tactics that are hopefully vetted or curated a little bit. And then each of us has to find the ones that work for us. And once we've made the determination to say, these are those ones, those are the tactics that go into your individualized toolkit.
So we shouldn't use SSRIs to deal with anxiety. I say that facetiously, but the difficulty I see with my generation, for I shouldn't just single out my generation, the difficulty I see with people adopting this type of framework for dealing with not just anxiety, but kind of any mental neurosis, any mental affliction, is you have to do a lot of soul searching and a lot of digging. And again, like in order to start that, you have to start. And in order to continue doing that, you have to sit with all those dirty, unrefined thoughts. You know this, and I know this. As soon as you start really doing mental and emotional work, you realize a lot of things about yourself, and they all feel like shit. You feel horrible doing this. But for some reason, you and I kept doing it until we got to a healthy point. But sometimes when you sit with it, you're immediately like, oh, okay, I feel anxiety, and it's not just about I can't control Trump or I can't control the climate. I'm feeling this anxiety because I have a real problem with control. I need control in my life. And that control mechanism that I find that I need is actually seeping into all of my other things. I need control in my job. I need control in my romantic situation. I need control in the way my sociality works. And so you realize that the anxiety isn't necessarily caused by these broad, heavily emotional things like politics or climate or whatever. It's caused by something that you're doing to yourself. But that thought and that revelation is so difficult to comprehend and so difficult to get to. Is there a baby step that people can take? Is there something that people can slowly do to start training themselves? Like you don't just go into the gym and bench press 225. You have to work up to it. Is there a working up to getting out of your head?
It's a really good question. A bunch of different things come to mind. The first is going back to the idea of asking somebody how they're doing, what they're feeling, what they're struggling with or sitting with, and starting to pull on those different threads, right? If somebody were to do that a little bit themselves, they will eventually get somewhere, right? And the question is, how far do they want to get, or what level do they feel comfortable with? Now, I'm also, I try to bring in some of these different, I guess, like philosophical lenses. And one of my lenses is, and I will say, like, where this comes from is I'm a software developer. So in the engineering world, there is kind of this saying that there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs, right? As in, there's no perfect solution. Everything has its pros and cons. And so why I bring that in right now is to say, when somebody is going down that path and they come up across something within themselves that you alluded to, right? They come up on some revelation or some fact about themselves that doesn't sit well. They have a decision to either press forward and continue investigating that or stop. And what I would actually say is that there is no perfect answer there, right? And if you look at it, right, the pro and the con is if there is something that is really difficult that you say, I don't know how to deal with this right now, the pro of that is if you stop, you don't have to deal with that pain right away. The con is that that pain is still unresolved. And so it's going to create issues later on in your life, right? You're sort of kicking the can down the road, but that's not all bad, right? I think some of us would say subconsciously that maybe we're going to kick it down the can down the road because maybe that thing's going to resolve itself on its own and we're not going to have to deal with it. The other side of the coin, right, is to say, okay, I came up with this thought or I had this revelation about myself and it was really scary and I pushed forward and I pressed on and I investigated it. The con there is that that's probably going to be really painful. You're going to experience a lot of emotions that most people would rather not deal with. The con is that if you do that work and you're diligent and you're steadfast and you work with the right people and whatnot, you're probably going to get somewhere really good. So again, it's to look at this and say to ourselves, there are many reasons on either side of the fence to do or not do something when it comes to our mental health. And I think this again goes back to the context of every person's situation, right? If somebody is just beginning their mental health journey and they're like, and I'm just going to throw this on the table, right? And if they say, hey, I know that I had this traumatic experience when I was a kid, but I can't deal with it, like that's totally okay, right? So the baby steps would be figure out what is causing you a little bit of stress today. Is it, hey, I'm asking myself, how was work? How were my relationships? When I talked to a certain person, did I feel a certain way? Start with some of the more surface level things. And then as you go along, you will eventually find the wherewithal or the poise to go a little bit deeper. It doesn't have to happen all at once. It can definitely be a little bit of a progression. So that would kind of be my recommendation. But I guess, in terms of tactics, like how does somebody begin that, right? It could be meditation, it could be journaling, it could just be sitting down and relaxing and being with your thoughts and thinking about them. It could be talking to a therapist, it could be talking to a loved one. I don't exactly know how that looks for every single person, but those are some of the immediate avenues, right? Is just thinking about, I have this feeling. How do I address it in some capacity? And how do I address it in a way that doesn't completely destroy me in this moment if I'm just starting my journey?
We've been talking for the entire conversation, and this is on me, about getting out of your head, but we never necessarily discussed what the incentive is to get out of your head. Why do we even need to do that?
A lot of people in the spiritual realm or, kind of in the new agey space will say like happiness comes from presence. Life is lived and enjoyed in the present when you are out of your head and you're not, spinning scary thoughts around and whatnot. You're able to appreciate everything around you. Again, with the nuance, right, or the pro con piece is when I say we're in our heads, right? I really there's a couple different things that could mean. So, and this is what kind of gets us into trouble is when I say we're in our heads, I mostly mean that we are engaging our critical thinking skills, or at the very least, we are turning something over many times. So the pro con is basically that, you and I have jobs and we show up to work every day and we do our work, and most likely we are incentivized or paid to put on our critical thinking hats and solve problems, right? In a way, and it's not a bad one, but in a way, when we are doing that, we are going inside our heads, right? We are trying to solve these problems, figure out solutions, whether it's, building a software program or coming up with a complex financial model, what have you. Now, on the con side of getting into your head is we also obviously, we're humans, we have emotions, joy, happiness, peace, love, fulfillment, but also joy, fear and anxiety and anger and distrust and regret, all these different emotions, right? And so when we get in our heads over emotional battles, we often find that we can't solve them, right? So what essentially happens is we're trained 40 hours a week or whatever the number is. We're trained to get in our heads and solve analytical problems. And then we go home And maybe we stay in our heads and try to solve emotional problems. And the difficulty is that when we do that, when we stew on our emotions, they really only kind of grow and fester, or that tends to happen, right? So, to answer the question more succinctly, is to say we want to get out of our heads in the right moments, because if we are getting into our heads over our emotions, especially negative ones, then we are probably making ourselves feel pretty bad, right? And so if we get out of our heads, then we are able to disconnect from those emotions, untether from them, find that presence once again, and just have a little bit of joy and say, look, I'm going to go spend time with my friend. I'm going to go play a video game. I'm going to go do something enjoyable rather than thinking about, hey, in 5 years, in 10 years, the climate's going to look like this. The country's going to look like that. All these people are going to be divided and whatnot, right? I'm not saying that those issues are not important. It's just to say that in this exact moment, right, those issues, they still are important, but like what's more important, right, is that you enjoy the moment in front of you, or that you worry about something regardless of the topic. You worry about something that's 1 year off in the distance, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years.
I'll be as abrasive as I need to because I think that this is a really fascinating point and I want to double click on it as many times as possible. What the fuck is the point of focusing on this if it does nothing for you positively? We have some type of collective masochism where we're forcing ourselves to think about these things. Either it's a subconscious thing or it's a consciously subconscious thing, and I'll say what I mean by that. But we're forcing ourselves to think about things that are not doing anything for us, but causing us these massive amounts of harm that create a very conflicted internal space and very conflicted external space. Where did we develop that? Can we go back to first principles? What maybe is the genesis of this collective masochism, and how did we find ourselves so inadept or so inept at getting out of our head? Because in order in order to get out, we had to go in, right? Like there had to be some thing, and I don't think it's a chicken and the egg problem. I think that we were present, and then for some reason we went in our heads, and now we have to kind of shovel ourselves back out. But why did that happen?
This is where we're going to have to get a little weird or a little deep for a minute. So, there are many levels to this, but let's focus on two for the moment. So, the first is more present, like as in present day times. We have these issues that we struggle with. And one of the reasons we struggle with them is we are hyper aware of them. We're on social media every day. We go onto news websites. We go onto Twitter or X. We see all these harrowing news headlines and abrasive or divisive things on the internet about politics and climate change and whatever topic of the day, right? Whatever incensed topic. So I guess the first piece would just be thinking about the fact that we are reminded of these things all the time. Whereas 100 years ago, 500 years ago, if you really go back to 500 years ago, people who, let's say events that happened across the world, it wasn't even really possible to ever learn about those things. Or at the very least, it took 10 years, 20 years for somebody to, eventually get to you by boat, and the first 12 journeys, all the boat collapsed and everybody died. So we live in very different times where these horrible things are happening around the globe and we are reminded of them. We are informed of them within minutes of them happening. So the first layer here, right, is just knowing that we're in a very different world than we have been historically, as in, again, we're reminded of all these scary topics all the time. Now, I'm not saying that politics have never been a divisive issue. You go back, I don't even know exactly what president or what political figure I'm thinking of, but there's been political assassinations, and there used to be presidents and political candidates used to duel each other, right? They would walk 10 steps, turn around and shoot each other. So like it's always been a divisive topic. The real difference is that like what fills our Twitter feeds, what fills our email newsletters, what fills, the internet sites that we go to is we're reminded of these things all the time. So they're very, present and in our minds, and that works up those emotions one way or another. The second layer, which goes deeper and is, something that I already alluded to basically, is going back across time and going back through the course of human history and human evolution and saying, I don't know what everybody's beliefs are, but, and I'm not trying to dissuade or discourage anybody if they have devout religious beliefs or anything like that. But if you look at, probably what is the prevailing science or wisdom or whatever is most accepted across, I don't know, the world, you'd look at like the theory of human evolution, right? And you'd say that we are pretty close, if not really, really similar to gorillas or chimpanzees. And if you go all the way back in time, you say that, hey, like all living, all life on Earth probably emanated from a few common pathways, right? And then we go down those pathways and we say, okay, there is a world, and maybe I'm wrong, but there's a world where we are, there's enough commonality between us and a zebra, or us and a horse, us and a fish, right? And so knowing that we're on this progression of evolution, we can say to ourselves, like, okay, what changed? Where did things maybe go wrong? Let's think about that. What I go back to is this idea, this concept called evolutionary mismatch, which is basically to say that we are proverbial fish out of water in our current environments, right? We are basically very advanced apes that I'm not saying we never were supposed to get out of, the jungle or the forest, but like, I'll put it this way, is we got out of the jungle or the forest a lot faster than evolution could keep up with us. And so what has happened to kind of make this more concrete is, let's think about, a zebra or a chimpanzee, some animal that is out on the herds, the savanna of Africa, and they are out at the watering hole, eating, drinking, whatever. They, the way that their brain is constructed, it's similar to ours in the sense that it has, it has a fight or flight component. It has, a prefrontal cortex where they can think about things. But, for a chimpanzee or a zebra, that prefrontal cortex where we do our rational thinking is a lot smaller. And so when, let's say, a zebra gets chased by a lion on the savannah, what happens is they're pretty chill until they see that lion. They're not thinking about the lion all day, every day, causing their heart rate to spike and their blood pressure to spike and all that. The lion comes around and they're like, oh my goodness, I need to get the heck out of here. And they go into fight or flight mode. They run for their lives. God willing, they escape the lion. And then if you look at that zebra, I don't know how many minutes, but let's say 1, 10, 20 minutes later, they're back to chilling and they're not thinking about the lion, right? And so going through the course of human evolution and kind of saying, what's different between that situation and our situation, there's a few main differences. The first one is that we have a much larger prefrontal cortex than most species, most mammals. And that is also, kind of bringing things full circle, that is also a gift and a curse, or a pro and a con. The gift and the curse is, or the gift is, we're smart. We were able to build houses for ourselves, computers, jets and spaceships that took us to the moon and whatnot. The con is, with that same capacity in our brains, we can stew over those proverbial lions all day, every day, and cause our heart rate to spike even when a lion is nowhere in sight. And so really, right, like how did we get there? Basically what happened is we changed our environments so rapidly in comparison to the pace at which evolution occurs that now we're living in a very, very different environment from which our bodies and our brains were shaped. And so when we look at all these different ills in society, if I have anxiety, I have depression, XYZ, it's like, and I'm really, really not trying to be flippant. I would say, zebras don't get depressed. Zebras don't have anxiety. They have fear, right? And again, it's not to be flippant. It's to say the real problem, and quote unquote problem, right? Because it's trade-offs all the way down. The real problem is the environment. We are in a much different environment than we were designed for, and that's where all these problems arise. So, I guess, and I get just to be thorough here is the pro and the con is like, even though I get on this, this long-winded answer and talk about, hey, we're not designed for this world and whatnot, I sure as heck wouldn't want to go live in the jungle, So it's really, yeah, even though there's a ton of problems in today's society, and a lot of those stem from the fact that we're not designed to live in this kind of environment, I still want to live in it. You know what I mean? So that's kind of the trade-off that we deal with.
Did we as anxious creatures design an environment that fundamentally makes us more anxious? Or did we as creatures going away from our natural environment find ourselves anxious because we are not in our natural environment?
It's such a good question. I don't know for sure, but let's talk about a couple different things. At least one. The first one that I can think of is the fact that, so the brain in general, right? The brain hates, for the most part, hates uncertainty, wants to know how everything is going to go. And you could say at a very basic level that anxiety is essentially uncertainty multiplied by time, right? So if something is very uncertain, and it's off in the distance, you're like, oh my goodness, here comes my anxiety because I don't know how this is going to play out. And it's not like it's happening in 1 minute and I can deal with it and be done with it. It's like, oh goodness, I got all this time to think about and ruminate over what the heck could happen over this scary possibility, right? So the brain hates that uncertainty and wants to stomp it out. So what I would basically say, right, is like, and again, it's all pros and cons, is the brain does hate uncertainty. And so what we essentially did over time was we built an environment that tried to reduce uncertainty and tried to make us more comfortable, right? And that was all good. Like nobody wants to live, I live in Boston. Nobody wants to live in Boston without heat. Nobody wants to live in Boston outdoors during the winter, right? So, the negative emotions in us, that uncertainty, feeling, cold, afraid, hungry, whatever, those things drove us to change our environment. And that's a really good thing. Now, one of the cons of that approach is that you eventually get to the point where you've created a world or a life. And I totally understand that this is not the case for everyone. But in general, right, if you talk to historians, scholars, whatever, they would say life is easier and more comfortable than it's ever been. And yet we are more miserable than we've ever been. What's going on, right? One potential answer to that is the idea that we have created environments that are relatively comfortable, or maybe even so comfortable compared to what our bodies are designed for, that we don't know how to deal with quote unquote basic problems. And it's, again, this is not me being flippant at all. Like I'm in the same boat as everybody who is listening. It's just to say that if we went back 1,000 years ago and said, look at all the diseases that existed during that time, like 1,000 years ago, I think the lifespan was probably, you were expected to live to like 21 or something, at best. Right. And so you have to look at these things with that kind of lens and say, even though Brian is saying like, hey, life's easier than ever, and it almost comes off as dismissive, it's actually really to say, going back to the pros and cons, is saying like, the pro is that like we live nice lives and we live pretty long. And 1,000 years ago, that didn't happen. But what's one of the side dishes, one of the cons there is now we deal with, some meeting on our calendars. And yes, it's scary because that's what we only have so many comparisons that we can compare that scary meeting to. But in the grand scheme of things, if we talk to one of our ancestors from 1,000 years ago, they'd be like, you're scared of a meeting? That doesn't even make sense. I don't even know what a meeting is, but that still doesn't compute, So again, it's all just like thinking about, going back to actually answering your question, is saying the one throughput, or one through line that I want to, really highlight is essentially that how I would answer the question is, inadvertently, we used our negative emotions to build a more comfortable world. And that's an amazing thing. And yet at the same time, with that amazingness comes some side effects that maybe we didn't anticipate. A few of those being some of the, mental health conditions that a lot of us are dealing with.
I love this explanation, but there's still a really glaring missing piece for me that I feel like nobody's making eye contact with. So let's go back 1,000 years ago. And, let's not even go back 1,000 years ago. Let's go back 10,000 years ago. Humans didn't exist with skyscrapers and Netflix and cold and hot showers. We had to fight for the food that we wanted to eat. We had to make sure that we're fighting other tribes and other humans. You know, we can all read Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature to see the true levels of how violent we can get when we're under certain kinds of pressures. So all of that content exists for everybody to go and read. We don't have to talk about it on this podcast, but that's all there. We're still biologically almost identical. We probably have way more radiation and cancers lurking within us, but whatever. But we're still biologically and physiologically essentially identical to those humans 10,000 years ago. And they were dealing with so many more environmental pressures. And so, how is it that in the absence of those environmental pressures that we started becoming smooth? You know, like it's almost like we adapted in some way, but we're still the same human. That's the thing that doesn't compute to me is that how can we be the same species and we're not being hunted by tigers, we're not living with snakes in our places, we have access to grocery stores and water and sex if we need it. You know, like all of those things are there, and still for some reason we're finding pressures to tack on to each other. When we're talking about happiness, this would be pure heaven for those people 10,000 years ago, not having to fight for any food. But then we see people, you know, I'm writing a book, and I was talking about how people in, you know, lesser developed countries coming to developed countries and going through the hedonic adaptation, right? And so things like electricity, you know, they didn't necessarily have functioning electricity. Now they come here and they have outlets and free electricity and all of that. And then one day the electricity doesn't work and they're so fucking annoyed, right? And just a month ago, they never even experienced something like this. What is that collective hyperhedonic adaptation that we went with as a species? That we did we adapt to collective masochism?
There's a few things that I want to talk about here. Um, you kind of answered it a little bit already. So let me see if I can remember all these different topics. The first thing that I want to put on the table is for us to remember that the brain is designed for survival. The brain is not designed for happiness. It is meant to keep you alive and get you out of harm's way. That doesn't mean that we don't have the capacity for happiness, but that's how it's designed. The second piece is when we dig into that design and we say, what do we mean by that? And over what period of time? Some of the evolution research would say that, or like the estimate would be that our brains as humans, Homo sapiens, our brains have not evolved in somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 years. So we're still working with the same internal wiring and hardware as somebody from 80,000 years ago. Now, what that means, right, is we have the same mechanisms running. And so for the most part, those mechanisms are going to adapt to modern day circumstances. So what that would mean, right, in terms of our mental health is 80,000 years ago, when an ancestor of ours came across a tiger, that person's amygdala starts firing and his HPA axis starts firing. And the fight or flight nervous system says, get the heck out of here and run. This is a threat, right? We still have those mechanisms inside of us. And here's the last piece that I think is actually, I hope will answer the question, but I don't know for sure. So the last piece is basically this thing called prevalence-induced concept change. And what it basically means is that it's essentially the adaptation piece plus something like an Overton window in your mind or for your brain, right? So the prevalence piece is to say that, okay, if the brain sees a lot of a certain something, then it essentially associates that thing with the definition or with the term, right? So a good one would be, 80,000 years ago, we saw our friends and family and people that were in our communities get slaughtered. And we say to ourselves, that is violence. I see that all the time. We've got warring tribes and we go out into the wild and we fight each other. That's violence. Over time, right? And Steven Pinker talks about this as well, is we've become far less violent as a species. Now, the brain still wants to hold on to that term violence. And so what happens is when you bring in this idea of prevalence induced concept changes, essentially what happens is the brain starts to see far fewer instances of true actual violence. And it starts to see a lot more other instances of other things, right? Maybe hate speech, maybe comments that people don't like. And because the frequency of those events starts to go up and it says, hey, I have this term in my head called violence. And now I'm, almost getting to an extinction effect of, I don't even know what violence is anymore. It maps that word over to this new thing because the prevalence of that thing now kind of emerges and allows us to say, I have a new definition for that word because I see it all the time. So essentially, you bring that back, right? And you say, okay, whether it's violence or something else, let's connect this to mental health, right? Is yes, we are not dealing with live, scary, snarling tigers every day, but we are dealing with things that scare us, that feel a little scary, a little menacing, a little threatening. And so, in terms of prevalence induced concept change, we now have our version of tigers in our own lives. And the brain, in turn, says, just as I ran those mechanisms, the HPA axis, the fight or flight nervous system, the amygdala, 100,000 years ago in response to an actual tiger, I'm now going to run those in when I think about going on a date, going skydiving, having a meeting with my boss, right? And so that would be my, I don't know, harebrained theory of kind of encapsulating all of it.
No, I love it. I love it. I still want to make eye contact with one other thing, which is the brain is designed for survival, 100%. No disagreement there. The brain adapted in some way. The tigers stopped being the physical and they started being more emotional and mental and sometimes spiritual. I agree. I'm paraphrasing you, but I think we both agree that on that point. But the brain still is prioritizing and designed for survival, but it's making my survival less possible because suicidality is up to the highest it's ever been in civilization, recorded civilization at least. And so how are those two, how can we hold those two things simultaneously when the brain is trying to keep us alive, but at the same time, that same brain, and we should specify, is it the brain or is it the mind? Like, I want to make that specification. But that same structure is is generating and propagating and installing and instilling all of these thoughts that are making survival so much more stickier for the collective.
Yep. It's a tough question. I'll do my best. What I would say is it goes back to engineering and trade-offs, right? Is the brain is wired for survival. But let's not forget that the brain that we are talking about was constructed 30,000 to 100,000 years ago. And so as we have radically changed our environment, the solution, quote unquote, as in the brain that was developed or designed, whether you think there was a intentional design or just evolution, that brain kind of no longer fits or doesn't fit as well to the current environment as the one that it used to. And so as a byproduct, right, we're like, hey, we're dealing with outdated hardware. And one of the really unfortunate side effects of that is the brain doesn't know how to deal with some of these battles. And in turn, even though it is wired for survival, it's not perfect at survival. And so it finds itself as one of those fish out of water and says, given some of these circumstances, given some of these challenges, I don't know how to handle this. And even though I want to survive, this is something that I don't know how to deal with. And therefore, maybe suicidality looks like an option.
No, I completely get that. And I just want to layer everything up for people just because we've talked about so many different concepts just towards the end because I want to respect your time. We've been talking about how humans are kind of maladapted to our current environment. We were just ripped from our natural environment. We kind of blindly created this thing that we thought was more beneficial, and it is in a large in a very serious way, more beneficial in some very certain ways. But again, the trade-offs they happen. The brain is not adapted in that way because it was just stacked with certain other stuff. I think Musk in 2018 on his first Rogan appearance called it like the monkey brain, the lizard brain that has a super cute supercomputer on top of it, something like that. And so now we stopped having these physical snakes and tigers, and we started having these mental afflictions, and we're trying to get out of our head in that way. And so there are many different ways to go from this, and I can let you drive, but I also want to ask, let's say that we all started trying to create a society that is fundamentally better and that works for humans. Just off the top of your head, what are some things that you would want to see in that society?
Here's the hardest part, right? Is given everything that we've talked about, given the structure of the brain and all that, the answer would actually be to bring back a lot of things from our old environment, right? To make it such that our lives are aligned with our physiology. So that's not to say it's an impossible task, but it is a little bit challenging, right? And some of the things that I would say to actually give an answer, right, would be to say, first and foremost, we need real world physical interaction with other people. And we need closely knit relationships with at least one person, if not more than that, right? The challenge in today's world is, if you live in a city or, you're on social media or whatever, I'm not saying that you don't have friends, but the research really shows that most people these days, or the prevailing trend, is that people have a lot of, I guess, like surface level friends or like quarter level friends, however you want to phrase it, but don't have that too many of those deep, real connections that they can lean on, right? During times of struggle, during times of stress, right? And we really need that. If you think again about evolutionary psychology and whatnot, this got wired into us in the sense that 100,000 years ago, if you didn't have some close tribe members, if you weren't part of a tribe, whatever, that meant you were going it alone in the wild. It might be cold, it might be very dangerous, there might be other tribes, there might be animals, predators, all of that, right? So, one way or another, it got built into us to say, find other people, bond with them, create deep connections with them. So, that was really important and remains really important, even in our, tech enabled world of today. A couple other quick ones would be, and anybody who's listening could predict this, right? Is where I'm going with this. Is another one would be thinking about the way that we used to eat, right? We today we eat a lot of packaged and processed food. They say, hey, we eat, I don't know, 50% junk food or 20% junk food or whatever. Like, what does junk food mean? Junk food means there's literally no nutrients in the food, right? There's no vitamins, there's no minerals. And when you start digging into the nutrition science, it's like they'll say, hey, these essential vitamins, these essential nutrients, right? It's like that's not a catchphrase. Your body literally needs different building blocks in order to make it such that your cells are functioning properly. And obviously, your cells stack on top of one another to create organs and muscles and tendons and all of that. And so, if all we're eating is garbage out of bags, like I hate to say it, but our bodies probably aren't very happy with us. And, we might get those nice little highs, which again, pros and cons, those are pretty solid. But in the long term, right, it leads to disease, it leads to illness and sickness and all of that. So rounding it out quickly, it would be on the food level is getting back toward nature, right? Eating less processed foods, eating more foods that kind of align with, maybe where our ancestors came from, right? If we look at our genetics and say, hey, I came from Ireland, I came from Italy, like thinking about like all the years of people that ate a certain way, your body probably wants you to eat something like that. At the very least, it doesn't want to eat all these processed junk foods, And then, just finally to close things out, making sure that we're getting enough sleep, making sure that we're moving our bodies because we are not sedentary creatures. We've become sedentary creatures, but we're not designed to be that way. And the last one, I talked about, I said sleep, I said moving our bodies, What was the last one that I was going to say? I feel like I might have dropped this one for a second, but all in all, right, is essentially getting back as close as we can. Oh, sorry, I just thought of the last one. The last one is making sure that we're getting some sunlight, some safe sun exposure, right? In the sense that our bodies need vitamin D. Guess where vitamin D comes from? We really can't secrete it very often from foods. If you do, it's actually added into the foods. When people say drink milk because there's vitamin D in it, it's not like that naturally. We put vitamin D into the milk. So, where vitamin D comes from most of the time is we synthesize it from the sun when the sun touches our skin. So, making sure that we're, long and short is making sure that we're aligning ourselves with our own physiology, our own evolution, getting back toward a lifestyle more like that, that's going to help our brains feel better. And if we construct a society that promotes those kind of things, then in general, we're probably going to have a bit better mental health as well.
Brian, I think we need to grab you on the podcast for a round two because we didn't even talk about technology and how that is propagating a lot of this. And I want to go a little bit deeper on the philosophy side with you. But just to round out the conversation, um, if you had a magic wand and you could solve one problem in the world, what would it be and why?
This is where it gets tough because as we've touched upon a few of these large issues, it's tough where you're like, well, I'm going to pick one over the other. That's it feels like you're leaving some people out in the cold. At the same time, obviously the work that I do is in the mental health space. I am of the kind, I'm of the opinion that if I were to write enough books, sell enough books, whatever, to put myself out of business, that would be awesome. And so I'm not one of those people who's sitting around being like, hey, my customers are actually the people who are kind of not mentally well, right? I want people to get better. I've been through this struggle myself. I empathize with it. It's horrible. And so just to give an answer, I would say I'd love to eradicate mental illness. That would be unbelievable.
Is anxiety mental illness or mental affliction?
To me, it feels like semantics. I mean, I'm not trying to put I'm not trying to put words in anyone's mouth, right? If somebody has suffered horrendously from their own anxiety, as I assume, as I have, and I don't know, maybe you've struggled with anxiety as well. It's not me to say, it's not my place to say one way or another. So I'm just like, I know it's suffering, and whatever label we want to put on it from there, that is okay with me.
As a last question, what gives you hope in the world?
I think what gives me hope, and it's a little like abstract, is when you see those humanistic or human moments out in the world, you see that person hold the door, you see that person pay for somebody's coffee who's a stranger. It's funny because like those moments, even though they're actually pretty small, those are the ones where you look around and you're like, maybe we're going to be all right. Maybe humans are okay in the face of so much evidence to the contrary, right? When we're like, oh, I'm on Twitter and there's these wars and there's so much strife and division and all that. And then you see somebody do something kind for somebody, walk an old lady across the street. You're like, we might be okay. So it's those small humanistic moments that give me hope for sure.
Brian, this was a great conversation. I really did learn a lot and enjoy it, and I can't wait to have you back so we can dig a little deeper into what your IP is and how to get out of our heads. Where can we find you online?
For now, getoutofyourhead.com.
Perfect. Link will be in the show notes. Brian, thank you so much for today.
Thanks, man.